So, hope everybody had a good Holy Week and a good Triduum, and you're enjoying the joy of this glorious season. I was also thinking about this. A couple people mentioned to me that our study of the Passion and Resurrection narratives, our Passion narratives so far, has made a little bit of a difference to the way you heard the Passion account on Palm Sunday from St. Luke's Gospel, and how you might have heard the Passion account from St. John's Gospel on Good Friday. So I'm hoping that that was something that was helpful to you as you heard those readings this last week. So last week we talked about Simon of Cyrene and the women of Jerusalem on the way to the crucifixion. We talked about how Jesus was crucified. I gave you some background on scourging and crucifixion, and we talked about how they calculate the date of when those things transpired. So today, I'll give you, again, a little bit more of an orientation geographically to the areas we're talking about. We'll talk about something about the Old Testament and what it has to do with the Passion narratives. And then I'll give you some comments on the text that you were to read tonight before we turn you back to your discussions at your table. So, again, remembering the orientation of Jerusalem, this is the Old City, this is the Temple, and the Temple Mount area, the retaining wall around it. This is the Kidron Valley, River Valley out here, and then coming off the screen would be the Mount of Olives. Back here is the house of Caiaphas. Back here is Herod's palace. The Fortress Antonia, what we're calling the Praetorium. And then the other side of this wall, in this picture right here, so this is that same wall. This is the Fortress Antonia again. And then over here is the area that's called Calvary or Golgotha. Again, keep an eye on this. This is a wall that was the wall at the time of Jesus' crucifixion. So this area out here is outside the city walls. Even though there's these buildings out here, because these buildings were added later, and there's another wall out here off the camera that was the retaining wall at the time of this model. So this model was dated at the time of the fall of Jerusalem, 70 AD. But at 70 AD, the retaining wall was out here, but in 33-ish AD, the retaining wall was there. So that's why you see this wall here, and there's buildings beyond it. So some people get confused about that, about where was the city wall, and was Jesus crucified outside the city or not. Everybody got a copy of a handout, I think, as you walked in tonight that says Old Testament and Passion Narratives. Do you have that sheet? Everybody's got that? Okay, good. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that, but I put this picture up on the screen. Anybody know what event this is portraying? Not the Ascension. Starts with a T. Transfiguration, yes. So this is Jesus conversing with Moses and Ezekiel, and down here are Peter, James, and John, not knowing what to make of what's going on. But this is the Transfiguration. Neat little story is, back in 2015, myself and two of my priest friends, on Easter Sunday, after celebrating the whole Triduum in our parishes, we got on an airplane, we flew to Rome. And we spent the Easter week, in the city of Rome. And Father Rick and I, my classmate and good friend, we decided we were going to go to St. Peter's and we were going to celebrate Mass one morning. So we go in, and when you go into the sacristy, they assign you a chapel, an altar, to go say Mass at. And so you follow the server. The server walks with the cruets, and you walk with the missal and the chalice, and you walk to whatever altar they take you to. Well, the altar they took us to inside the Vatican was the altar underneath this painting. And so that morning, as I was celebrating Mass at St. Peter's in the Vatican, I'm looking up at the Transfiguration. So it was a pretty powerful moment. But the reason I put it up here today is because in this account, Jesus is conversing with Moses and Ezekiel. Why Moses and Ezekiel? Moses represents the law, Torah. Ezekiel represents the prophets. So Christ is in conversation with the law and the prophets. So that's an introduction to what we're talking about tonight here to begin with, is the Old Testament, the law and the prophets, also the historical and the wisdom literature, but the law and the prophets in conversation with the Passion narrative. So what I tried to give you on your sheet was some references throughout the Old Testament that point to things in the Passion accounts that we're studying. I'm not going to go into detail on every one of those because we'll be here for an hour and 15 minutes just doing that if I do that. But I do want to point out a few things. So who has a Bible with them tonight? Raise your hand, please, if you have a Bible. Okay. So, Alex, I would like you to look up Genesis 22. I saw a hand over there. Gretchen, can you look up Numbers 9, chapter 9? Who else had a Bible? Okay. Genesis, Numbers. How about Lamentations chapter 2? I need one more. Anybody else? Teresa, thank you. Can you look up Wisdom chapter 2? Okay. Then we'll get to those in a few minutes. So why are we looking at the Old Testament? The Old Testament doesn't matter. It was replaced by the New Testament, right? We don't have to worry about the Old Testament. Well, the same God who inspired the evangelists to write what they wrote is the same God who inspired the Old Testament writers to write what they wrote. So all of this is in the mind of God, who knew what was going to happen 10,000 years before it all happened. Jesus knew, God the Father knew what was going to happen that day on Calvary. And so he's inspiring authors throughout human history to write the things that he wants to be said. So the first thing is that it's the same one God who's inspiring both Old and New Testament. The other thing is if you look at the particular passages, chapters and verses of the text of the Passion narratives, you're going to see a lot of echoes from the Old Testament. Sometimes it's a very clear formula where it says to fulfill the passage. Okay, so obviously there's some passage someplace that's being fulfilled. Okay, so it's a very direct connection. Sometimes it's a little bit less. It's more of a repeating of vocabulary from Old Testament passages. So it's not a direct reference to a passage, but it's using the same language of a passage from the Old Testament is being used in the New Testament. Sometimes it's just the idea of something that happened in the Old Testament that's clearly underlying a text in the New Testament. So it's sometimes a much less direct connection, but still a connection that's there. Excuse me. So knowing those passages helps us understand what the authors had in mind when they wrote the Passion narrative. So there's a direct connection. And it's not just a connection to our 21st century Christian understanding of the Old Testament, but how those first century writers were familiar with the Old Testament. Now, when we talk about the Old Testament, we have to mention a couple of terms just to help us understand. So remember I said when we talked about the Sadducees and the Pharisees, the Essenes and the Zealots, remember that a few weeks ago? And we said the Sadducees only considered Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, we call Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. They only considered those inspired. Everything else that we call the Old Testament, they considered commentary. It's nice to read, might be helpful to read, but it's not the same level as Torah. Okay, that's the Sadducees. The Pharisees, on the other hand, would consider all the 46 books that we call the Old Testament, they would also consider sacred scriptures. Okay, so not just those 5 first books, but all 46. There had been commentaries on all 46 books. You might have heard this word someplace in your study of scriptures, a midrash. A midrash is a commentary on the scriptures. So for centuries, teachers of the scriptures have been writing commentaries, making commentaries on the scriptures. And so some people would consider those not, again, divinely inspired necessarily, but still important to read because it helps us understand a passage that we might not understand otherwise. It's kind of like the way we use the catechism today. The Catechism of the Catholic Church helps us understand some of these passages that we might get wrong. Without the Catechism of the Catholic Church, we might think John chapter 6, take this and eat unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you'll have no life within you. Oh, he's just talking about symbolically. Well, no, it takes the teachers of the church, the bishops, to help us understand that's not meant to be taken figuratively. It's meant to be taken literally. Okay? So it's so the midrashes help that. The other issue had is, now you got to remember the Old Testament, if you haven't studied the Old Testament, the oldest writings of what we call the Old Testament probably date to around 1000 BC, so around the time of King David. Okay? So and then you have the Babylonian captivity in the 6th century. So between the 6th and 10th centuries, there were things being written. Okay? After the 6th century, there's more. When the Jews returned, the Hebrew people returned to Jerusalem, there's more that's being written. Ezra, Nehemiah, the writings of Isaiah and Ezekiel and Baruch and minor prophets. So these are things that are being written down. Well, they're being translated as well because language evolves. So about 100 years before Jesus is born, there's a group of 70 scholars who get together and they write a translation that's the normative translation for the Old Testament. Okay? They call these 70 people the 70 people. In Latin, of course, that's Septuagint. But Septuagint sounds a lot more nicer and fancier than the 70 people. So the 70 people write this new translation. These would have been the scriptures that Jesus would have been familiar with, that the apostles would have been familiar with, the people writing the New Testament would have been familiar with, the Septuagint translation. You might see that sometimes abbreviated in a book LXX, which is the Roman numeral for 70. Okay, so the Septuagint translation of the Old Testament is what the gospel writers are drawing from. Now, why does that matter? Because if you look at a different translation of the Old Testament and you look at the Septuagint translation, there might be words here or there that are a little different. So you see a reference in the gospel to a passage from, say, Exodus, and if you, depending on the translation of Exodus you're reading, it might not match up. And you say, well, why doesn't this match up? It says it's supposed to match up. Well, it all depends on what translation of the Exodus account you're reading. If you're reading something that predates the Babylonian captivity, as opposed to the Septuagint translation, or even the Greek translation of that, the Latin translation of that, or the English translation of that. So just because we in our English don't see the direct connection to a passage doesn't mean the scholars who are reading these things in the original languages don't point out these connections. Okay? So it's the best thing I could tell you is that if you're ever going to study Hebrew and you want to read the Hebrew scriptures, read the Septuagint translation, because that's the one that makes the most difference to the New Testament. But I just wanted you to see that this is what Bible scholars do all day. They sit around doing these things to try and give us the best understanding of what these passages mean. Okay? So you see on your sheet, I broke it down into Pentateuch, Torah, the historical books, the prophetical books, and the wisdom literature, and then Psalms. So I thought I would just point out a couple of things. Who did I ask to pull up Genesis 22? Alex, can you read verses 1 to 14 for me, please?
The testing of Abraham. Sometime afterward, God put Abraham to the test and said to him, "Abraham, here I am," he replied. Then God said, "Take your son Isaac, your only one, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah. There, offer him up as a burnt offering on one of the heights that I will point out to you." Early the next morning, Abraham saddled his donkey, took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac, and after cutting the wood for the burnt offering, set out for the place of which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham caught sight of the place from a distance. Abraham said to his servant, "Stay here with the donkey, while the boy and I go on over there. We will worship and then come back to you." So Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac, while he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the two walked on together, Isaac spoke to his father Abraham. "Father," he said. "Here I am," he replied. Isaac continued, "Here are the fire and the wood, but where is the sheep for the burnt offering?" "My son," Abraham answered, "God will provide the sheep for the burnt offering." Then the two walked on together. When they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. Next, he bound his son Isaac and put him on top of the wood of the altar. Then Abraham reached out and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." "Here I am," he answered. "Do not lay your hand on the boy," said the angel. "Do not do the least thing to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you did not withhold from me your son, your only one." Abraham looked up and saw a single ram caught by its horns in the thicket. So Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering in place of his son. Abraham named that place Yahweh Yireh. Hence people today say, "On the mountain the Lord will provide."
Thank you very much, Alex. Okay, just to ask, as you heard that passage, I'm hoping little flashes of light are going off in your brain, and you're seeing a connection to what happened between Abraham and Isaac and the Lord and Jesus. Did you see some connections? Can anybody tell me one of the connections that they heard?
God will provide the sheep.
God will provide the sheep. Thank you. What else?
Put the wood on.
Yep.
The only son.
The only son, his favorite. Yep.
Put the wood on his back.
Put the wood on his back.
And carried it.
Yep. Anything else anybody caught?
Sacrifice.
Sacrifice. Thank you.
We found the lamb or whatever.
They found the lamb in the thicket, right? And that's what they ended up sacrificing. Yep. It was a ram, wasn't it? Yeah. Yep. Anything else? I also noticed Moriah was the place where it happened. Anybody know what we call Moriah today? Jerusalem. Jerusalem. Same place. He's bound to the altar. Somebody mentioned that yesterday morning. He was bound to the altar.
The will of God.
The will of God. Yes, very much so. Now, one really big, important difference. What's the biggest staring you in the face difference between the tale of Abraham, Isaac, and the Lord and Jesus and the Lord?
One, they stopped the sacrifice.
Yeah, with Abraham and Isaac, God stopped it. With Jesus, he didn't. Okay? But so you see, it's not nowhere in the Passion narrative does it say to fulfill the scriptures, but it's very clearly, isn't it, in the mind of the authors as they're writing the Passion narrative, this tale. I think I pointed it out to you 2 weeks ago in the slides. They're right next to the 13th station and the Stations of the Cross in the Church of Holy Sepulchre is this big mosaic of Abraham and Isaac. So it's very clearly in the minds of the evangelists, even though they're not directly quoting any part of it. On your sheet, I'm not going to go over every one of these, but Exodus 12 and Numbers 21, we hear about the Passover meal, the Lamb of God sentence when the lambs are being slaughtered, a la John's Gospel. The vinegary wine breaking out of his bones, we read that for tonight. I did have a section of Numbers. Who had Numbers? Gretchen, did I say Numbers 9?
Yeah.
Can you flip to Numbers 21? I transposed my numbers. So Numbers 21, verse number 9. I had written down 9, verse 21, but it was 21, verse 9.
Accordingly, Moses made a bronze serpent and mounted it on a pole. And whenever the serpent bit someone, the person looked at the bronze serpent and recovered. Okay, thank you. So if you remember the story, what happens is the people rebel against God. God sends seraph serpents among them, and the serpents are biting people, and the people are dying. Moses cries out to God for mercy. And what does God tell him, as Gretchen just read? Take a bronze serpent, mount it to a pole, and anybody who looks on that will be saved. Remind you of anything? Somebody raised up on a pole as our salvation. Okay. Thank you, Gretchen, for that. Then the historical books, so these are the books that talk about the history of Israel. 2 Samuel has David praying after his trusted friend plans to betray him. Sound familiar? David crosses the Kidron Valley to the Mount of Olives, where he sorrows and prays, and resolves not to lose his followers to the same fate, but to go up to Jerusalem to wait a reunion, while the betrayer goes and hangs himself. Sounds a little familiar, doesn't it? 2 Maccabees. If you know those story, these are the people at the time of the Greek conquest of the Mediterranean area. People are the Greek culture is trying to be forced on the people of Abraham, and they're trying to hold on to their customs. And so you have people dying a noble death when they could have been spared because of their reverence for the Lord, and as witnesses for future martyrs, knowing that the King of the universe will raise them up to everlasting life. And their tombs were venerated in Jesus' time, just like Jesus' tomb would also be venerated. So you see some connections there in Maccabees. The prophetic books, if you were at church, I think on Palm Sunday and Good Friday, we read from Isaiah about the suffering servant of God. So there's a lot of references in Isaiah to the suffering servant. Very common references to the scriptures, not so much in the Passion narrative itself, but lots of things. So Isaiah chapter 50, the suffering servant of God is slapped and his face spit upon. We saw that last week happening to Jesus. In Jeremiah, there's a plot against Jeremiah. Poor Jeremiah suffers so much. There was a plot against Jeremiah, and the assembly of the priests and others, and all the people say that the innocent blood should be falling upon themselves, and that he deserves death. Let his blood be on us and on our children. Let him be crucified. Just like Jeremiah. Who did I give Lamentations to? Thank you. Lamentations, chapter 2, verse 15, please.
All who pass by clap their hands at you. They hiss and wag their heads over daughter Jerusalem. Is this the all-beautiful city, the joy of the whole earth?
Thank you. So people passing by, mocking the person, right? Hissing, wagging their heads. Again, sounds familiar, doesn't it? You would also see in Lamentations that the servant is, or the suffering one, is silenced even when they're hit. Just like we know the Lord Jesus was silenced even when he was hit. Ezekiel, one of my favorites, we have the story of the dry bones and the people rising from their tombs, just like Matthew has the tombs opening and people rising from them. Book of Daniel, a couple references. The Son of Man in clouds in chapter 7, referring to Jesus as the Son of Man in Mark 14. Daniel says this, you will see the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. It's almost exactly word for word what Jesus says. And you will see the Son of Man seated on the right hand in the heavens. The dead are awakened in Daniel 12, just like Matthew has the dead arising, as we saw in tonight's passages. And then that Susanna trial that we read at Mass a few days ago, where Susanna is falsely accused of sleeping with somebody, and it's all trumped up false witnesses, just like false witnesses presenting testimony against Jesus. And we have a lot of references in Amos. In Amos chapter 8, there's darkness and the timing of the suffering and the judgment, an allusion to Mark's timing in chapter 15. Also Zephaniah and Joel referencing the same thing. Mourning as for an only son. We see that, we heard that on one of the readings in Holy Week. People mourning as if for an only son, and that's in Mark 15. Zechariah, strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. We see that in Mark and in Matthew. Zechariah 11, 30 pieces of silver being mentioned. We saw that with Judas, right? And then they shall look on him whom they have pierced, Zechariah 12. And that's the same thing we see. They shall look upon him whom they have pierced with Jesus on the cross. In the wisdom books, Proverbs chapter 31, giving strong drink to the dying and wine to those in distress so they could forget their misery. Remember we said last week when Jesus was crucified, they give him a wine drugged with myrrh so that would cause him to not suffer as much pain on the cross, so he'd last longer and he would be tortured even longer then. Wisdom. Who did I give wisdom to? Teresa. Thank you. So if you could look at Wisdom chapter 2, verses 10 through 18, please.
Let us oppress the righteous poor. Let us neither spare the widow nor revere the aged, for they are grown white with time. But let our strength be our norm of righteousness, for weakness proves itself useless. Let us lie in wait for the righteous one, because he is annoying to us. He opposes our actions, reproaches us for transgressions of the law, and charges us with violations of our training. He professes to have knowledge of God, and styles himself a child of the Lord. To us he is the censure of our thoughts, merely to see him as a hardship for us. Because his life is not like that of others, and different are his ways. He judges us debased. He holds aloof from our paths as from things impure. He calls blessed the destiny of the righteous and boasts that God is his Father. Let us see whether his words be true. Let us find out what will happen to him in the end. For it is the righteous one, the Son of God. God will help him and deliver him from the hand of his foes.
Did you hear all those references? So let us oppress the righteous poor man. Let us lie in wait because we don't like what he's saying. He professes to call himself a child of the Lord. But what was the charge against Jesus? The very sight of him is a burden to us because of his manner of life, and like others, his ways are estranged. Let us see if his words are true. For if the righteous man is God's son, he will help him. Remember, if he's the son of God, let God come and save him and rescue him. This is right out of wisdom. So again, they're not saying as to fulfill the scriptures, but it's very clear that these passages are in the mind of the evangelists. Whether they just happen to remember them on their own or God is inspiring them to remember them, this is happening. There's a connection with these Old Testament passages. The Psalms. So Psalm 22 is sometimes called the Passion Psalm. So it's not narrating what happened, but there's so many references to what happens to Jesus. Now remember, Psalm 22 is written by whom? King David. Do anybody remember when? Around 1000 BC. So 1,000 years before this, King David is being inspired to write Psalm 22. It's spoken from the perspective of the suffering servant of God. So this is like a Jeremiah-like figure, somebody who's suffering because of their connection to God, or the suffering servant of Isaiah. Again, hundreds of years before Jeremiah and Isaiah are born. Now, the interesting thing is that Psalm 22 kind of talks about a Messiah. But the Messiah that's expected at the time of Jesus is somebody who's more of a military hero in the line of King David, a conqueror, somebody who's going to kick the Romans out of town. Okay? But Psalm 22 connects that idea of Messiah with the suffering servant of idea that Jesus actually is. Okay? So he frees us from captivity, but not captivity to Romans, rather captivity to sin. So it's meant for us, Psalm 22, to help us when we feel like we're suffering because of others, to we maybe feel abandoned by God, to remember that God vindicates the just. It's associated with the crucifixion when Jesus utters his dying words in Mark and Matthew. So Mark and Matthew's dying words, we'll talk about in a second, come right out of Psalm 22. So verse 2a, my God, why have you abandoned me? Verse 7b, we consider him reviled and considered nothing. Verse 8a, those observing me sneered at me. They wagged their heads, 8b. Verse 9, let the Lord deliver him. Verse 19, they divided my clothes and cast lots. You can see all of these in those things that we read for tonight. There's other Psalms too that I gave you on your list. Psalm number 2, people gathering against the Lord and against his Messiah, as we see in Matthew and Luke. Psalm 31, which we prayed on Good Friday. Into your hands, Lord, I commend my spirit, right out of Luke 23. Psalm 34, the Lord is watching over the bones of his just ones, so none of them are broken. Psalm 38, those close to the afflicted stand at a distance. We see that in Mark's gospel. Psalm 41, the trusted friend is partaking of the just man's bread and raising his heel against him. What happens with Judas at the Last Supper? He shares Jesus' bread and acts against him. Psalm 69, they gave me bread for my bread, gall, and for my thirst, vinegary wine. We see that in Mark, Luke, and John. And then finally, Psalm 110, to my Lord, sit at my right. Jesus says he will be sitting on the right of the power in Matthew 14. So you see that there's references in the Psalms as well to what happens. So my point in pointing this out to you is to help you to know that certainly the evangelists are familiar with these sacred texts. Okay? Some of them they quote directly, some of them they're just in their mind, some of them they're being inspired to reference. So the evangelists clearly know them. And in time, it all points to Jesus fulfilling these Old Testament scripture passages. And finally, to remember, who's the one inspiring the evangelists? The same person who is inspiring the Old Testament writers. So it shouldn't be far-fetched for us to think that that would be the same. Okay?
Is this kind of what Jesus did on the road to Emmaus? Explain from the beginning how everything foreshadowed.
Yeah, very likely. Yeah, no charge.
Do you have the sheet?
It's hard telling, but my guess would probably be no. So, to talk about tonight's text, so remember what we've read so far in the Passion narrative. Jesus has been arrested and tried. He's taken out of the city and he's been crucified, right? Attached to the cross and left to die. This, by the way, again, as a reminder, is in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where the spot marks the 12th station. There's an altar top here. Underneath the altar is a hole in the ground that you can touch where it says that's where the cross of Jesus stood. And then you've got here an image of Jesus crucified, and then here's the Blessed Mother and St. John again. Also in the church, so I think I mentioned before that people were going to the place where Jesus rose from the dead as soon as 150 AD. Okay? They knew where that spot was. So they start building markers and shrines. 350 in the era of Constantine, when St. Helena goes back to the Holy Land and claims the true cross, there's a more permanent shrine erected. There's other shrines developed over Calvary. And over the years, over the centuries, these buildings are expanded to what we have today as one giant complex of building that houses the spot where Jesus rose from the dead and the spot where Jesus was crucified. They call it the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. In the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, between the steps going up Calvary and the area where the tomb is, there's some mosaics on the wall. And one of those mosaics is this one right here. This is Jesus being taken down from the cross and placed in the arms of his Blessed Mother. We've got figures like Joseph and Nicodemus and Mary Magdalene and the other women here receiving Jesus' body from the cross. Right by this icon, this mosaic, there is this area right here. So this is the door that comes in from the outside. So who's been in Jerusalem? Anybody? Okay, so if you remember the door into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, there's these two arches. One of the doors is closed, the other one's open. People come in out of that door. That's where that ladder is above it that they can't move, that's been up there for 150 years. So that's where this door is here. People walk in. There's a slab here, and I'll show you that slab in a minute. But hanging above it are all these candles and lamps, okay, marking this holy spot. And the pilgrims here, these people around this area, they're all kneeling and venerating the spot where Jesus' body was prepared for burial. They're even taking their holy objects, anything from rosaries and crosses and bookmarks and whatever they've got, headdresses, whatever, and they're wiping them on this spot so they'd be touched by the spot where Jesus' body had laid as it was being prepared for his burial. Okay, so you see that all day long when you go into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. This is that slab right here. So it's probably about 3 feet wide, probably about 9 or 10 feet long, and it looks like it's some kind of stone, like marble or something. And this is what they call the Unction Stone, unction being the Latin word for anointing. So this is where Jesus' body was anointed in preparation for burial. And then those lamps are hanging above here. And then this is the other icon on the wall right behind it. Shows Jesus being laid out on top of a white cloth and being prepared for laying in the tomb. And again, it's the same people around here. The Blessed Mother and St. John and St. Mary Magdalene and Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus and the women. These are the people who are around. So I just thought I'd show you that because we're talking about these things, and these are things marking the spots where these things happened in Jerusalem. So when we talk about the death of Jesus in the texts, we can talk about the timing, what Jesus' last words were, the situation of the wine, his actual death, and the signs that appeared after his death. We can then talk about the witnesses who saw it and what they saw, and then I'll make some comments about John's gospel. So Mark and Matthew both say at noon there was darkness, and it lasted until 3 p.m. Not saying it didn't last after 3 p.m., but it lasted at least until 3 p.m. What would the darkness have reminded people of who were reading these, who were familiar with the Hebrew Scriptures? The plague. So darkness is a curse from God. Remember the plagues, the 10 plagues at the time of Moses in the Exodus. It's prophesied in Zephaniah and Joel and Amos. And darkness is a sign, again, of God's coming judgment. Just like it was in those 10 plagues. These are signs that God's about to act in judgment, and his judgment is very near. St. Luke also says at noon there was darkness until about 3 p.m. Now, you got to kind of think back to what you remember from reading the earlier chapters, especially the infancy narrative according to St. Luke. What is in chapter 1, what is Jesus referred to as? A light for those in darkness. In chapter 2, when he meets Simeon and Anna in the temple, Simeon says that he shall be a light for the nations. So this is Luke, as an author, drawing back on the light-darkness imagery from chapters 1 and 2, putting that now in the Passion narrative at the end. And Luke 22 talks about the power of darkness, which seems to reign in this hour. So Jesus talks about the power of darkness. So lightness and darkness in Luke's gospel have more symbolic meanings as well that he's drawing on for his reader. The words of Jesus at the end in Mark and Matthew, the only words Jesus says on the cross, he screams out Psalm 22. In Mark, Eloi, and Matthew, Eli. What should we hear? When we hear Eloi or Eli, we should be hearing God. God is El in Hebrew. Okay? So, Mishael, Raphael, Gabriel, Israel, Nathaniel. That El always has to do with God. Mishael, who is like God. Raphael, the healing power of God. So when you hear Israel, who wrestled or contested with God. Okay? So when you hear that El, you should hear God. Okay? So Jesus screams out Eloi or Eli. It's pretty much the same thing. Why have you forsaken me? Okay? Notice he's not praying Abba. Why have you forsaken me? He's definitely quoting Psalm 22, isn't he? My God, why have you forsaken me? Now you got to remember, Mark, Matthew, Luke, emphasizing the Synoptic Gospels, emphasizing the humanity of Jesus. How do we know that? Simon of Cyrene, we talked about that last time. The prayer in the garden, okay? That Matthew, Mark, and Luke show the humanity of Jesus more than the divinity. So is it unusual that a human being suffering, perceiving the absence of the action of God to save them, might cry out, why have you forsaken me? John, that can't happen, right? John has no Simon of Cyrene. John doesn't pray to be relieved. John's Jesus doesn't pray to be relieved of the cup. John's Jesus can't say, my God, why have you forsaken me? Okay? Because he's emphasizing the divinity of Jesus, and the divine, in eternal communion with the Father, can't possibly do those things. Okay? But the humanity of Jesus most certainly can. He's experiencing the absence of the Father's intervention. Notice I didn't say he's experiencing the absence of the Father's presence. Can Jesus ever experience the absence of the Father's presence? No, even in his humanity. He does, though, experience the absence of the Father's intervention. Why aren't you doing something to stop this? I know you're present. Would he talk to him if he wasn't present? No. So he knows he's present. He knows he's listening. But he's experiencing this lack of the Father's intervention. Luke doesn't have Jesus cry out Psalm 22. Luke has Jesus calling out Psalm 31. Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. Now, this is important in Luke's gospel. How does Jesus come into being in Luke's gospel? The angel says, the Spirit of the Most High will come upon you and overshadow you, and that's how you will conceive your child. So it's the gift of the Spirit that brings Jesus and his humanity into existence, right? So what does Jesus give up at the end of his earthly life? The Spirit. The Spirit given to him in his incarnation is now being given back to the Father. He places that Spirit, by the way, spirit, wind, breath, all the same word in Hebrew. Ruach. You got a when you say it. Ruach. So he gives back his spirit. He gives back his breath. He gives back his wind. Okay? By the way, another reference back in Luke, The first words the Father says, Jesus says, I must be about my Father's business. He's praying to the Father throughout his passion. So Jesus knows the Father is present. He's praying to the Father. John, completely different. There's none of this experience of abandonment. Can John's Jesus experience abandonment from the Father? Absolutely not. Could he struggle with praying to the Father? No, he can't struggle with praying to the Father. So what does Jesus do? He doesn't talk about the experience or the lack of experience of God. He says, quoting Psalm 22:16, I thirst. Why does Jesus say he thirsts? Because he knows that will elicit a response. So, unlike Matthew, Mark, and Luke's Jesus, where things are happening to him, who's in charge of everything that's happening in John? Jesus. He knows he can make people respond by saying, I thirst. And they do. And they respond by doing what? Taking some vinegary wine. Interesting here, remember the wine I mentioned a few minutes ago? The wine mixed with gall? The Greek has one word for that. That's a sweet wine mixed with gall. This is a vinegary wine. It's a different word that's being used in Greek. So they're pointing out this different thing is going on here. They take this vinegary wine, stick it on something, and put it up to his lips. Okay? What do they stick it on? Hyssop. Now, for the Jewish readers of this, bells are ringing. Okay? 2 sets of bells. First one, Exodus, the Passover, the night when the angel of death went through. What were the Hebrews told to do to their doors? Put the blood on the lintels and the doorposts. What were they supposed to use to apply it with? Hyssop. They would have got that. Because the same instrument handling the blood that brought them salvation is now the instrument being used to Jesus who brings us salvation. Okay? The other thing, hyssop. Psalm 51. For those of you who hit Mass here on Friday mornings, and we stay for morning prayer, which we'll start doing again this week, what psalm do we almost always pray as the first psalm on Friday mornings? Psalm 51, the Miserere. Okay, have mercy on me, O God, in your kindness and compassion blot out my offense. One of the lines, cleanse me of hyssop, that I may be purified. What is hyssop used for besides marking the doorpost? Cleansing us of our sins. Who is the hyssop being raised up to? The one who cleanses us of our sins. They'd have got that. They would have known Psalm 51. They would have known the story of the Exodus. When they heard hyssop, they would have gotten it. Now this time Jesus drinks the wine in John's gospel because this is the cup that he's always been meant to drink. And at the end, what does he say in John's gospel? It is finished. What is finished? Well, certainly his life, but much more than that. The mission. The mission he was sent for is accomplished. The whole reason he came here is now being fulfilled. This is the end. This is his hour that he's constantly referred to. Remember at Cana, my hour has not yet come. Why are you telling me about this not having wine business? Okay? This is the hour. This is the moment. This is what it's all about. And so he says it is finished. It is accomplished. It's like when we say at the end of Mass in Latin, if those of you who remember Latin Mass, ite missa est. The mission, the Mass is completed. We've done what we came to do. This is what Jesus is saying now on the cross. This is it. I've finished what I was sent for. This was my purpose. It's done. In the wine offered in Mark and Matthew is different from that first offering. As I said, it's a vinegary wine. It's given now to mock. Remember, the other one was to numb the pain, so he'd last longer on the cross. This one's given completely in mockery. Psalm 69, I just quoted for you a few minutes ago, the bitter food. The bystanders in Mark and Matthew now mistake, remember the cry? I said it was Eloi in Mark and Eli in Matthew. They think Jesus is saying Elia. Hear it? Eloi, Eli, Eliah. What do we say? What's Eliah in English? Elijah. So they say, oh look, he's calling Elijah. Do you see how much closer it is in the Hebrew than it is in our English? So if you say Eloi, why are they thinking Eloi is Elijah? They sound very different. But in the Hebrew, it's Eloi, Eliah. You see how it sounds much closer to the same word. So they think he's calling for Elijah. And they say, just as we heard in the Old Testament, let's see if Elijah, remember who Elijah is? The guy in the fiery chariot dude that went up to heaven? Okay, God's prophet. Luke doesn't mention the mockery here because he mentioned it previously in verse 36. Then comes the actual death of Jesus. Mark and Matthew, Mark says, they're pretty much the same here. Mark says he let out a loud cry and then he let go. He expired. Expired. Expired is a physiological term that means to breathe out. Okay? He expired. Pick the word apart. Ex means out from. Spire is breathing. But remember what breath, wind, and spirit are? The same word. So he's letting go not only of his breath, which is something that's happening to him because his body is failing, but he's letting go of that spirit. Okay? Matthew says he let out a loud cry, he let go of his spirit. So it's the same thing. They're both saying the same thing. He let go of the breath he was trying to hold on to. So this is more, again, things happening to Jesus because his body is failing. Okay? Luke says almost the same thing. He expired. Remember, he breathed out. John, because John's Jesus is emphasized as God, things don't happen to Jesus. Jesus is in control. So what does John's Jesus do? He bows his head, not from exhaustion, because can God be exhausted? No. Okay? He bows his head. Who's standing down? If he's raised up, who's standing down there? Mary and John, right? So he bows down to them. And what is the language that John says? He hands over the Spirit. It's not because his body is failing that he breathes his last. And if you've ever been with somebody as they breathe their last, you know that's very often what it looks like. They just breathe, they exhale and expire, and that's it, right? Jesus doesn't. He hands over the Spirit. It's almost like he's saying, here. He hands over the Spirit to Mary and John at the cross. Again, Jesus in John's Gospel is in charge of the whole thing. It's finished. Then he hands over, bows his head, and hands over the Spirit. What are the signs showing that everything knows that Jesus has died? Mark and Matthew give us this tearing of the sanctuary veil in two, from top to bottom. The sanctuary veil. So inside that building that I called the temple, there's the outer area and then there's the Holy of Holies. From the ceiling to the floor, from wall to wall, is a veil, thick carpet wall. Okay, thicker than these things. Okay, hanging from ceiling to floor, wall to wall. Okay, that's the temple veil. It signifies behind this veil is the very presence of God. Okay, that's why you can't go back there because it would kill you if you did. Okay, so there's this veil to mark that spot. It's torn from top to bottom. If I take a piece of cloth and I tear it, where does the tear start? In my hands or away from my hands? In my hands, right? I can't tear from this side towards me, right? Unless I put my hands over there and then tear, right? So wherever my hands are tearing, that's where the tear starts, and it goes the opposite direction. It goes away from where my hands are, right? If somebody on earth was tearing the temple veil, where would they have to start? The bottom up. They make a point of saying top souls of the dead. The body, and it actually says the bodies. It doesn't say the souls. The bodies of the dead. Boy, does that point forward to the resurrection, doesn't it?
How big of an area was that the bodies were rising?
What does the text tell us? The text just tells us in Jerusalem this is happening. So remember the diorama that I pointed to, Caiaphas' house, Herod's palace, the fortress Antonia, someplace in that area in Jerusalem, that's where these things are happening. Okay. So this is all in the place where it's happening in the city. What's Jerusalem? The holy city, the city of God, right? It's where God dwells. It's where God did dwell until he ripped the curtain. Who's there when this happens? Mark and Matthew start with the centurion. If you've ever heard me talk about the Gospel of Matthew or Mark, almost one thing you certainly have ever heard me say. The entire Gospel of Mark has one climactic moment. And the climactic moment is not the crucifixion of Jesus. The climactic moment is this centurion right now. Truly, this was the Son of God. The centurion in Mark's gospel saying that is the first human being in all of Mark's gospel that gets who Jesus is. The very first one. Demons got it, but they have a supernatural knowledge. The first human being. Peter came close, and then he messed it up and got put back in his place. The first person who gets it is the centurion. Not the 12, not Mary Magdalene, the centurion. Why is that important? What is the centurion seeing that nobody else ever saw? The cross. The centurion is there and he sees what happens. And because he sees what Jesus did, he's the first person who gets who Jesus truly is. He didn't come to be named a king. He didn't come to work miracles. He didn't come first and foremost to heal people. He came for that. And the centurion, this is the most important passage in the entire Gospel of Mark. Because this is where the first person gets who Jesus is and why he's come. Deb?
Wouldn't Mary and Joseph be people who...
Not according to the Gospel, according to Mark. First of all, Joseph isn't even in the Gospel of Mark, right? So the first person, because they didn't go to the cross either, so they don't know. According to Mark's theology, centurion gets it. Not because he was a man of faith. Was the centurion a disciple of Jesus? No. But he saw that. And when he saw that, that made all the difference.
Isn't there something to him not being a non?
Sure, absolutely.
Right.
That a non-Jew is the one who recognizes it. Sure, absolutely, there's something to that. Matthew says the same, and a little bit more, because Matthew always makes Mark more dramatic than Mark. He said, and the people feared greatly. They were all moved by what happened. They feared. Didn't say they came to believe, said they feared. Who else is at the cross in Mark and Matthew? The women. So they tell us that Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, or Mary the mother of Joseph, Joseph, same word, and Salome, and others. So Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joseph, or James and Joseph, depending which gospel account you're reading, and Salome, and then some others. What does the gospel account say they did? They ministered and they did not abandon him. They ministered to him and they did not abandon him. What's the implication? They didn't abandon him, but some other dudes did. Peter, Andrew, James, John, Thomas, James, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Simon, Jude. Mark also says that the interesting thing, again, about Mark, so picking up on what Kathy said, the centurion doesn't know who Jesus is before this moment, right? He's not a disciple. He's not been hearing his preaching. He's not been witnessing the miracles. He doesn't really know who Jesus is, but he comes to understand and confesses it boldly. Truly, this was the Son of God. The women, in contrast, who know who Jesus is and are supposed to fully get who Jesus is, don't acclaim Jesus. Who's standing close to the cross? The centurion. Who's standing far away? These women. The people who are supposed to know are not close to the cross. People who are supposed to know don't acclaim Jesus. The guy who isn't expected to know is close and does acclaim Jesus. So he is setting up literarily, at least. Now, I know you may be trying to think, well, logically, there was a barricade around there maybe or something, so they couldn't get close. But what's the author trying to tell us? The author is trying to tell us that there's a group who should know they're distant and not acclaiming Jesus. There's the one who's not expected to know he's close and he is acclaiming Jesus.
Embrace the cross.
I'm sorry?
They're telling us to embrace the cross.
Yes, absolutely. In St. Luke's version, the centurion glorifies God and acclaims Jesus' innocence. Truly, this man was innocent. Not truly, this man was the Son of God. Okay? So in Luke's version, the centurion does not acclaim Jesus as Lord, but he does acclaim Jesus' innocence. What verse is that? 39, thank you. Yeah, no, Luke. 47. Okay, the centurion who witnessed what had happened glorified God and said this man was innocent. Glorified God and said this man is innocent when he sees Jesus. So he sees Jesus, he acclaims his innocence, and glorifies God. What would the reader of Luke be drawing a parallel to here? Jesus comes into the temple as an infant in the arms of Mary and Joseph. Simeon approaches, recognizes who Jesus is, glorifies God, and acclaims Jesus. So you see the parallel? At the beginning, the person who doesn't know Jesus recognizes who he is and glorifies God. Here, the centurion who doesn't know who Jesus is recognizes Jesus and glorifies God. So Luke is drawing another one of those parallels to the infancy narrative. The crowds were told. The crowds beat their breasts. In Luke's gospel, probably more than any of the others, the crowds always get who Jesus is. From the beginning, the crowds are always favorable to Jesus. Where the authorities are trying to persecute him, where the authorities don't get it, the crowds always do. All the way up to Palm Sunday. The leaders, remember the Pharisees and the scribes are trying to get Jesus. If you don't know the passage, go back and look in Luke's gospel at the Palm Sunday account. The Pharisees and leaders are trying to get them to shut up. We heard it on Palm Sunday here in the gospel account at Mass. They're trying to get the crowds to be quiet. And Jesus says, you could try, but even if they do, the rocks and stones themselves will cry out. Right? Remember that? So all the way up to Palm Sunday, the crowds are acclaiming Jesus where the leaders don't get it. Now on Good Friday, the crowds kind of forget what they know and they shout, crucify him. But now here's the crowds again. The crowds walk away beating their breasts. They're not glorifying God, but they do know that something bad has just happened and they're asking for mercy from God. They know they've done something wrong. So are they fully getting who Jesus is yet? No, because they'd be glorifying God like these other people are, but their conversion's on the way. Okay, they do recognize they've done something wrong. And then there's the acquaintances. Doesn't tell us who the acquaintances are, but he says they're at a distance, including the women from Galilee. So the acquaintances are not the women from Galilee, so the acquaintances must be somebody else. So who might those acquaintances be? Could be members of the 12? Don't know. Luke doesn't tell us. But he does tell us there's some people there besides the women from Galilee who are ministering to him. Then there's John. John makes a request to Pilate. The Jews didn't want the spectacle during the feast, so they asked for a quick death removal. The soldiers act. They pierce the side to verify Jesus is dead. This is really, really, really important in John's gospel. Or as they say in Kairos. This is really important. I think you should write this down. Immediately, blood and water flow out. Okay? Think the theology of John here. What does water to a Christian remind us of probably more than anything else? Baptism. What does Jesus' blood as a Christian remind us of probably more than anything else? The Eucharist. What is Jesus giving us? Remember, Jesus is in charge. Nothing happens to Jesus. Jesus is giving us from the cross baptism and Eucharist. Why baptism? There is no church without baptism. That's how everybody comes into the church, right? And what does the church need more than anything else to sustain it in being? The Eucharist. So what is Jesus giving birth to from the cross? The church. This is very Johannine theology, strong Johannine theology, John theology. Jesus gives birth to the church from the cross because he gives us blood, the Eucharist, and water baptism.
And also his bride, the church, from his side. Like Adam, Eve was made out of the rib.
Yes.
Adam's side.
So
Oh, did I? I'm sorry.
that's okay. That's all right. It's also the blood of the Lamb. Can I take questions at the end because we're starting to run out of time? Okay, sorry. The eyewitness. This is important in John's Gospel too. The eyewitness testifies to these things and says that they're true. Who is this eyewitness? Most likely, John, the son of Zebedee, one of the 12. Okay? John, son of Zebedee, one of the 12, who is the beloved disciple, is most likely that witness, because we know he's there. Okay? Because Jesus does that exchange between Jesus or John and the mother, right? The mother of Jesus, Mary. So, if the beloved disciple is the one giving the witness, this is one of the arguments for two people being involved in this sentence. These things are true because the beloved disciple, the eyewitness, says they're true. Would this guy be talking about somebody himself in the third person? No. He would say, I'm telling you these things because I saw them and I know that they're true. So there's two people here being referred to. The person who's narrating and the person who's the witness, who we believe is the beloved disciple, John, the son of Zebedee, one of the 12. Okay? So if that's the case, then who most likely is not the one putting the pen on the paper? This guy over here. He's being referred to in the third person. Okay? This is one of the signs that shows us very likely the person putting the pen in the paper in the Gospel according to John is not probably the beloved disciple. But who's he getting his stuff from? He's telling us. The beloved disciple. John, one of the 12, the son of Zebedee. See that? So it's okay that he's not the one putting the pen on the paper because everything the guy that's putting on the pen on the paper is writing comes from this guy. Okay? So if I'm writing a story of Beth Casbin and I'm getting all my information from her children and her husband, is it okay that I'm not the one who knows these things, but they're telling me all these things? Of course it's okay, because they know her better than I do. Okay. Does that mean that John, the son of Zebedee, one of the 12, is not an evangelist? No, it doesn't mean that, because what does evangelist mean? The person who tells the good news. He told the good news to the person putting the pen on the paper. So it doesn't not make him an evangelist just because he didn't put the pen on the paper. Then he tells us the scriptures are fulfilled. Let the legs not be broken. That's a reference to the Passover lamb from Exodus 12 we talked about earlier in Psalm 34. They will look on the one who they pierced, Zechariah 12. Calls the reader and the hearer to believe because of witness, thus receiving the Spirit as opposed to those who saw but didn't believe. Okay. The burial. Mark and Matthew say it's at evening, after 3 p.m., of course, because that's when Jesus dies, and before sunset. So it's still the preparation day, it's still Friday. Joseph of Arimathea. All four Gospels mention Joseph of Arimathea by the same name. Okay? Likely that they all made it up? No. Not when they all have the same exact detail. Okay? We don't know where Arimathea is. Very likely it's in Judea someplace. It says he's a member of the Sanhedrin in Mark and Matthew. He's awaiting the kingdom of God. That means he's pious. That means he's prayerful. Does that mean he's necessarily a disciple of Jesus? No. The Jews at that time were awaiting the kingdom of God too. They were awaiting somebody, the Messiah, to come in and kick the Romans out of town and establish the kingdom of God. Matthew does say as disciple, but here's the thing. Matthew, remember the gospel according to Matthew is written probably 50 years after the resurrection. Okay? All four evangelists refer to Joseph of Arimathea by name. Is it likely the community knows he's a disciple? Yes. That's why they all four mention his name. Remember I talked about Simon of Cyrene, why they mention him by name? Because the community knows who he is. Okay? But at the time, there is no evidence in the text that he was a disciple of Jesus before Jesus' death. He's never mentioned in any other scene. He's never referred to. There's no evidence anywhere. The women at the cross are referred to in other places. Joseph of Arimathea is not. Okay? There was a custom at that time for Jewish leaders to not want these bodies left on the cross. They would take them off the cross and bury them because they didn't want them on the cross. And if they had no family to do it, somebody would do it because they didn't want them on the cross for the holy days. So just because he removes Jesus' body from the cross doesn't mean he's a disciple of Jesus. There's no indication. The only thing is what's most likely a put back in. So remember, Matthew's being written 85 AD, about events that happened in 30 AD. It's likely that the author refers to him as a disciple of Jesus because he becomes one, but not necessarily because he was one up until the point of the crucifixion. Okay? So Mark and Matthew, Joseph of Arimathea, he goes to Pilate for the body. We talked about that. This is not a very fancy funeral. This is not a typical Jewish burial at this point. It's very sparse. There's a linen cloth known as a Seton, which I'll get back to next week. It says there's a tomb in the rock. Matthew adds that's a new tomb. Nobody's been there buried before. So because nobody's buried there before, there's no other bodies in that tomb. So if the body of Jesus goes missing, well, how do you know it's Jesus' body is missing? Maybe it's one of the other bodies that are missing. But if I say it's a new tomb and nobody else is buried in it and there's a body missing, there's only one person's body it can be, and that's Jesus's. So Matthew adds that detail. It's a new tomb to clarify what's going to happen here in a few minutes. They lay the stone across. They use the Greek word lithos, which is stone, as opposed to petra, which is rock. So it's not a raw, unfinished rock rolled across the tomb. It's a finished stone being put across the tomb. Okay? So they use the word lithos, not petra. And Mary Magdalene and the other Mary remain. Luke's gospel. It's the day of preparation. The Sabbath is about to begin. That's very much in line with Mark and Matthew. Joseph of Arimathea, who is described as virtuous. Remember, virtues are habits for the good, so he's a good acting person. And righteous. Righteous means keeps the law. So he's a very active adherent to the religion of Abraham. He's a member of the Sanhedrin, but not consenting to what happened, still awaiting the kingdom. So again, he's pious, but he's open to understanding. Where else do we see in the gospel of Luke, going back to the infancy narrative, we see people who are pious, but not necessarily understanding everything about what's happening, but wanting to be righteous. No, Luke's gospel. I'm sorry? No, that's Matthew. Luke's gospel. Anna and Simeon in the temple, at the presentation of the temple, they're described as righteous and pious and devout. Zechariah and Elizabeth, they're open to understanding what's happening. Zechariah has his conversion. Elizabeth proclaims Mary. Simeon and Anna praise God when they discover Jesus. These are not people who are Christians, but they're righteous and they're open to understanding. Just like Joseph of Arimathea, not necessarily a Christian at this moment, but he's righteous and he's open to understanding. So see, Luke keeps bringing us back to that infancy narrative. You see it over and over again. The burial cloth is there, the Seton, the tomb in the rock is unused, and the women return with spices and oils, and they rest on the Sabbath according to the commandment, because they're righteous too. John's Gospel, Joseph of Arimathea, a secret disciple, read back into the text just like in Matthew, goes to Pilate for the body, but now somebody else is there, Nicodemus, the person who first came to Jesus at night. Why does somebody come to Jesus at night? So nobody will see him. That's when secrets happen, right? In the dark. Okay? So Nicodemus comes at first because he's not real sure and he's afraid. Is Nicodemus afraid now? He's coming in bold daylight. Has he come to belief? Yeah. Okay? Remember the Gospel of John? It's all about people coming to belief. He brings 100 pounds of myrrh and aloes. Guess what? How much myrrh and aloes would be needed to bury a body of the size of Jesus's? About 12 ounces. He brings 100 pounds. You don't need 100 pounds of myrrh and aloes to bury one body that's 5.5, 6 feet tall. But what's the author telling us? This is God's funeral. We can't just bring 12 ounces of myrrh and aloes. That's what the lady brought who anointed Jesus' feet and wiped his with her hair. This is God's funeral. This is God. This is Jesus, the Son of God, who died. He brings an exorbitant amount, 100 pounds of myrrh and aloes. This is an honorable burial in John's gospel because who are we burying? The Son of God. There's burial cloths, plural, not just the Seton, multiple cloths. He's buried in a garden. By the way, where did our Passion account begin? In the garden. Where's the Passion account ending? In a garden. What's garden? Places that are lush and beautiful, right? Who deserves a garden more than the Son of God? Lush and beautiful. Who's there at this point? Unlike the icon that's like a conflagration of a bunch of things, what does the text tell us? Who's there in the Gospel of John? At this point, who's there? 2 people. Joseph and Nicodemus. That's what the text tells us. Joseph and Nicodemus. 2 people who have come to belief in Christ, which is the point of the whole gospel, right? Last bit of information here. Okay, so this is inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. When you come around the corner from where that anointing stone was, this is what you see. You see this big building here and these columns. These are windows. It's a huge building, but inside the big building is this little building. This is the door of the building. This is the tomb. This is where Jesus is buried and rises from the dead. It didn't look like that in first century Palestine. That's what it looks like now. But they built that over the spot where Jesus was buried and where he rose from the dead. The doorway here is like this tall. 4.5, 5 feet tall, so you have to bend down to get into it. You get in, there's a space probably about 6 feet square, and in the middle of it there's like a holy water stoop, and then you walk around that holy water stoop and there's another like 4-foot door, and then you're in the actual tomb, and to your right there's a slab about 7 feet long that's got a limestone slab, and underneath it there's a marble slab, and that's the place they say Jesus' body was laid and where he rose from the dead. That space, besides that slab, there's another space next to it where people can stand, probably about 4 or 5 people if they stand shoulder to shoulder. I was very blessed when I was in Jerusalem that we had a priest at 6 o'clock in the morning who took us there, and for 4 of us said Mass on that spot. I was very, very fortunate. I have a picture someplace of me kissing that spot. I'm sorry? Let's see. So the burial takes place at evening. We talked about that, the guards of the tomb. So only in Matthew does this exchange happen with the guards at the tomb. It's the next day following the preparation day, so what does that make it? The Passover, the feast day, right? The chief priests and the Pharisees who hitherto in Matthew's gospel are not really involved, they go to Pilate, say this impostor said he would rise up after 3 days. Search the Gospel of Matthew. Nowhere does Jesus say that he's going to rise up after 3 days. So they're false witnesses again. They told Pilate to secure the tomb lest the body be stolen. Okay, who's going to steal the body? Now, if somebody was going to steal it, who was going to steal it? Who has a motivation to steal the body? There's somebody who does. Yeah, the followers of Jesus. They've got a motivation. Because if they can convince people that Jesus got up and walked out on his own when they really stole him, then they can make up this whole story that Jesus is risen from the dead. Right? Okay. How likely is it, this is Mark and Matthew now, this is Matthew's gospel, how likely is it that those 11 people, because one of them went out and hanged himself, the 11 people who ran away and can't be found because they're afraid they're going to be next, are going to come back and do something as bold as robbing the grave and stealing a body out of it when there's guards there? Not very likely. Not to mention the fact that this is a huge crime for the Romans. Robbing a grave is a huge, huge crime for the Romans. Doesn't matter whose grave it is. That's a big deal for the Romans. So they're going to purposely be seen when there's guards around. It's not like you take the body and stick it in your pocket and say, well, it wasn't me, I don't know, They're not doing that. They'd have to break into the tomb, past the guards, commit a crime that they could be seriously punished for, when they're afraid they're already going to be seriously punishing just being a friend of Jesus? Not very likely. Okay? Did I make a good case, counselor? So they tell him that somebody's going to steal the body, so they want the grave secured. Pilate says, if you want the grave secured, here's some soldiers, go and take care of it. And that's where the Passion narrative ends. And that's when I'm going to turn it back to your tables for your discussion. Questions, I think, 5 and 9 are the questions for personal reflection, so you don't have to do those at the table. A lot to ponder, David.